Hi, today's Tip Tuesday is, what is a contingency? We've previously done Tip Tuesdays on what is a contingency. As mentioned recently, the California Association of Realtors has updated our California contract. And this is the contract that I'll refer to as the RPA, which stands for the Residential Purchase Agreement. So what is a contingency? A contingency is a condition that has to be met prior to the close of escrow. An example of some contingencies in an RPA, Residential Purchase Agreement, is a loan contingency, an appraisal contingency, investigation contingency, which means that the buyer has a right to do any and all inspections, including, for example, driving by around 3 o'clock in the afternoon to see what the school traffic is like, if there's parking, or going by on the weekends. Maybe a neighbor likes to throw Super Bowl parties every weekend. Based on that investigation contingency, the buyer can pretty much cancel for any reason. And then one of the last ones is review of any reports or disclosures. An example of a report could be the preliminary title report or the city report. And then the disclosures are the required disclosures that are required by law for the seller to provide to the buyer. The buyer or seller can actually add contingencies to the contract. The ones I just discussed are actually pre-written, and typically they're 17 days, but it could be more or less depending on what the parties agreed to. So an example of a contingency that you can add, say the seller is selling the home, but they want to purchase a home, a replacement property. So they could tell Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I will sell you my house, but it's contingent upon me finding another house. Or vice versa. If the buyer's purchasing this home, the buyer can add the contingency that it's contingent upon them selling their home and closing escrow, because that's where their deposit's coming from or their down payment. So if they can't sell that house, then they obviously can't afford to purchase this home. Another common question is, how do these contingencies affect me? They affect you differently whether you're a buyer or a seller. For example, majority of the contingencies are for the buyer. They protect the buyer. So how does that affect the seller? When you get a fully executed contract, that's when the time frame starts ticking, the seller actually pulls the property off the market and waits for the buyer to complete these items. Remember, this is a condition that has to be met prior to the sale. So how does that affect the buyer? It's a benefit because one of the agreements when the buyer gets into contract is to put an initial deposit in escrow, and it's held there, and that deposit is used towards your down payment and closing costs. That deposit is refundable up until the contingency is removed. So for an example, the buyer has a loan and an appraisal, investigation, review of reports and disclosures. And maybe the buyer removes their investigation contingency. That means they're satisfied with the condition of the home. Well, this is an active method contract, which means that you have to physically in writing say that this home is acceptable. If it's 17 days in the contract, on the 18th day, it doesn't automatically be removed. That's what an active method is. That contingency continues to be in effect until the buyer physically removes it in writing. For the buyer, it's a protection because that deposit that they have in escrow is refundable up until they remove that contingency. So what does that mean? If the buyer removes, they're satisfied with the condition of the property and they still have a loan and appraisal, the lender comes back and says you're qualified for the loan, the property appraises at whatever purchase price, we call it at value. And so all of those contingencies are met, and then they've reviewed all the disclosures and reports and the buyer's satisfied. So at that point, the buyer physically in writing removes their contingencies. Well, at that point in time, your deposit is no longer refundable. So if the buyer decides to back out or cancel for any reason, they forfeit that deposit to the seller. So it's really important that before you remove those contingencies in writing, that you make sure your loan's in place and you're 100% satisfied to move forward because you are committed. And for the seller, it's a benefit because they've taken the property off the market, waited for this buyer to complete these items or to satisfy these contingencies. So now if the buyer canceled, the seller would benefit because they would be able to retain that deposit. So hopefully that was understandable. And if you ever have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us because there's a lot of detailed information that could have been added, but trying to keep this video short, precise, and to the point was very difficult. So hopefully this all makes sense. Thanks again for tuning in to our Tip Tuesdays. If you like what you see, please hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell notification so you can be notified when we post these because we post them every Tuesday. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next week.